Thank you, everyone. Both an honor and a pleasure. The biggest panel, most populars, right? It's a little bit complicated, but maybe I can do this. We follow the art. First time I did it at school towards a teacher, wasn't very successful, but little did I know that I'm getting to do it again. Certainly a release to know that. Thank you. There are two modes of communication in the art world and probably the world in general. It's showing and telling. And at the field meeting, these two modes are particularly well balanced. Sometimes institutions tend to separate those who show and those who tell. But here we have a great opportunity to do both and to change and exchange these two modes. However, communication can only occur when a pause occurs. So showing alone and telling alone can probably be connected together. And today we, in the morning session, we did experience an amazing telling of a story by Francesca, who told little of what she actually does in Kabul. We've heard the story, and we had a sense of it, but probably we would like to know more. Followed by Lara, who introduced a term that I did not know before, and I would like to ask her to probably elaborate on it. New Asian canon, followed by content, and followed by storytelling. Storytelling by Francesca and showing of its mechanics, shall we say, by Lara also surprised me. So I would like to ask you probably to connect these two modes of communication.
Thank you. In Kabul, I'm currently the director of the Institute for Arts and Architecture, a school where we teach traditional crafts. We do ceramics, it comes back, jewelry, woodwork, and calligraphy and miniature painting. I arrived in Kabul to write a book, and then I stayed in various capacities. What you've read on the brochure was clearly not what I presented, because I was cornered by Leeza at the last minute. This is very much my private practice, and it's the first time that this mode becomes public in this way. So I'm very grateful for having been cornered. I did not think it would work for me, but it actually did. So thank you. And for me, this way of storytelling I've been writing these little stories for the past 10 years, and without rationally thinking about it, they've become the way in which I make sense of the world and the places where I am and the things that I do. So for me, storytelling is very much the engine that gives sense to what I do.
So you asked about is this working?
It's working.
Okay.
It's working. I would like to know how the canon, the content, comes through storytelling. This was laid out in your presentation that way.
Right. So our perspective in Hong Kong of the world and visual culture and art means that when we're looking at canons and we're looking at the creation of kind of dominant narratives, we're sort of recentering them from our perspective here in Asia. And so as a museum, it's important for us to tell stories about our objects, because our main job really, so much of what we do is narrative. And so when you're creating a canon, you need to tell stories about that canon from your perspective. So rather than taking the canons of the West and using that as your starting point, or even kind of responding against that, to kind of start from a place that's a little bit open and exploring, what's here and telling stories about what's here as the starting point for creating this new way of looking and this new way of seeing in our region. And so that takes the form of, many different, we're not just talking about storytelling in terms of writing. I mean, my own background is, as I mentioned, as a writer. So that's the kind of fundamental storytelling, but it makes its way into so many different forms of media and expression and visual expression. So the objects themselves that speak volumes can also be sort of interpreted and narrated from our perspective as a museum.
Thank you. And we do put labels on next to artworks. There are also texts about them in the booklet. Again, these are snippets of stories that are being told, and we all read them. But I would like to ask the artists who brought the works to show, and now they are shown with little stories next to them. I would like to ask each one of you how your work has changed in this collective story now, and what you intended to show, and how it presented itself when it actually entered the show. Shall we?
Well, my story began with my mother, as always, and her collection and her collective. And story began with her asking my father for a sewing machine. And the sewing machine became this Mercedes-Benz of sewing machines in the community, and it gathered people, women especially, and these embroideries that she kept were the stories that influenced me as a child. I drew them, and I didn't think I'd ever actually have the opportunity to tell this story or to show them. And I think now that they have come to this kind of exposure, yes, my story has changed. It's become part of her collective as well. But visually, I think I'll look more carefully at what she's done as well.
I'm going to translate, yeah.
معرفی کن. من علی شایسته هستم. چیز دیگه.
Yeah, the first works on the right side on Warehouse 46.
راجع به نحوه شکل‌گیری
What is the story of your works? Yeah. This series that you're showing.
از یه وقتی حدود فکر می‌کنم 10-12 سال پیش شروع کردم به نوشتن هر چیزی که توی ذهنم بود، توی سرم بود. این یه جور برام کار روان درمانی بود.
I've started writing like just for myself personal notes as kind of like my personal notes about like my emotions, kind of like روان درمانی, like psychotherapist or something.
تا حدود 10 سال این کار رو ادامه دادم و بعد از 10 سال با یه تعداد خیلی زیادی کاغذ مواجه شدم که داشتم جمعشون می‌کردم و از این با خودم حملشون می‌کردم جای مختلفی که می‌رفتم.
I've been doing that for 10 years, and after 10 years I realized that I have a bunch of these papers and all these notes that I'm just carrying with myself everywhere.
بعد نگران بودم کسی اینا رو ببینه چون تقریبا هیچ سانسوری نکرده بودم و همه چی توش نوشته.
They were all my private notes, so I was concerned if anyone read it or see it.
بالاخره یه روزی تصمیم گرفتم که اینا رو آتیش بزنم.
And finally, at some point, I decided to burn them all.
منتها قبل از اینکه بخوام آتیش بزنن اینا رو دوباره نشستم خوندم.
And then I started reading all of those or some of those.
But he says before burning them.
Yeah, he started just reading and reviewing them again.
از لابلای اون نوشته های بی‌معنی چیزایی در اومد که برای خودم شگفت انگیز بود.
And between all those notes, which some of those like didn't make sense, when I read it again, I found some notes that were very interesting and like surprising for me.
شگفت انگیز بود به خاطر اینکه اصلا احساس می‌کردم کسی دیگه اونا رو نوشته و حرفای خودم نیستن.
Because after 10 years, I was like, I'm not the person who wrote this.
It was as if someone else wrote it.
Yes, exactly.
چیزایی فکر می‌کنم چیزایی بود که تو زندگی یاد گرفته بودم که نباید بگمشون. دوست داشتم این حرفا رو از سوختن نجات بدن، از نابود شدن نجات بدن و اونا رو بعضیاشون رو روی کاغذهای بازیافتی نوشتم و بعضی دیگه‌شون رو روی پارچه‌هایی که توی کارگاهم باشون رنگ پاک می‌کردم نوشتم. اینطوری هم کاغذهای بازیافتی، هم تیکه پارچه‌های رنگی و نوشته‌ها رو هر کدوم به یه نوعی از نابود شدن نجات دادم. این نجات از نابودی منو که توی یه خانواده مذهبی زندگی کرده بودم به یاد مفهوم زندگی بعد از مرگ انداخت. مجموعه بعدیم در مورد همین بود. در مورد این که من همیشه از بچگی انگار این خیال راحت رو داشتم که من اگه پیر میشم، اگه از بین میرم، دوباره قرار به وجود بیام.
So then I decided not to burn the notes, and I kept some. So I collected some of those notes, and also I've been collecting some of the materials or fabrics, papers that I was working on it. So I've decided to save all those notes and the materials that I've been collecting for many years. And he said for him, the idea of keeping and saving those personal notes and also those materials came from growing up in a religious family, which we grew up with like saying there is a life after you die and you should save yourself and life continues after that. So then he realized that he has the tendency to save everything, not only himself, but like the notes, everything, like the materials. And the next series, like the repetition comes from the same thing, thinking about another life which continues after death.
Nadira Jan, can you introduce?
Yes, so my name is Nadira Hussein, and just to situate my work in the warehouse 46 are the colorful curtains and large paintings with a lot of pastel colors. And yes, maybe I can just tell you a very simple-minded anecdote from childhood that I grew up in a mixed culture, in a Parisian apartment with, let's say, a totally Indian furnished interior. And I was, yes, let's say, consuming all those inputs, and in the mind of a child, I was not able to create borders, cultural borders between, for example, the comics I was reading, such as the Smurfs, to the depiction of, for example, Indian gods as Krishna, and I would naturally connected them because they were blue. So I think I grew up, but maybe not so much, because my mind still tried to look at the world like this, and yes, what I'm trying to express in my paintings is to, yes, use all those symbols, signs, that are coming from different constructed context, and to decontextualize them and to recreate new associations which are maybe offering potential of new narratives, which are also questioning genders, which are questioning power structure, let's say, which are intending to give more space for being how we would want to be, or something like this. And of course, like, to go back to your question of what is maybe the object of art from the studio coming into an exhibition context, which has also yes, problematic, like thinking about thinking collections, or being next to all of you. It's, of course, recontextualize again all maybe what we are doing in, yes, I think in a larger context and the discourse. So I found it also interesting to see all those layers added to the transportation of an artwork in all those exhibitions and things.
Yeah, the story about my work today is about the people of my country, and yeah, like that. So our generation are like we are grew up in the country with the two names, because the name called Burma and then Myanmar, because the country changed the name in the 1989, yeah, a year after the big protest and revolution. Yes, yeah, as my generation, like we saw the like a 1988 revolution and 1996, and yeah, so some of my friends involved in the person and I didn't involve. But when we look at our generation, the whole generation, so we are like fully of the revolution trauma, and yeah, so our body is like fully with the kind of the mark from the revolution, yeah, also, yeah, so that's why I make the work to that. And the second part is like, yeah, because of the revolution, because like our country is like since the 1962 to the 2010, like live under the military junta, yeah, so region, so this is the longest one, and so, and also the civil war is start a year after the independence, so 1988. So till now they stay fighting. Well, I want to make a kind of the live version of that fighting, yeah, because it's the first version is like already strong and you know, like, so the fully of blood, and yeah, so that's why the second version I try to make alive, because you know, the civil war, like usually there are people fighting each other, yeah, you know, our own people fighting each other because of some problems. So that's why now I'm try to fighting with you, like with the rubber band, and yeah, so yeah, so that's a thing.
We like to ask artists to tell us these stories because that gives a unique access to their work. That's why it's very often also it's being channeled into an institutional storytelling and then put out as content. I would like to ask if any one of you were surprised or perhaps even in disagreement at any time when your work was presented by others, when your stories were translated into this public context.
Just happened to be that I have something to say. It's a good question because we're not artists, but we're here.
Can you please go ahead and introduce yourself, your names?
Yes, so I'm Vladislav, and this is Olga, and we're showing a limited liability pavilion upstairs in space 47. And it's called Limited Liability Pavilion because it started in Venice Biennale, I think around 6 years ago. And our country doesn't have a pavilion there. Which is pity because, you know, most of the countries have. I think it's 80 now. And we thought how to present...
And the country is?
Kazakhstan. Yeah. And we thought how to present Kazakhstan without this, you know, kind of official representation on a governmental level, or how to be as objective as we can and present a real situation, a bottom line civil society initiative, and how artists are actually can exist without institution and without infrastructure. Because after the collapse of Soviet Union, the Soviets didn't really leave any contemporary art museums, as you can imagine, and it's not there still. So we did it guerrilla style, a lot like they did in St. Petersburg in the 80s. It was just an exhibition in the apartment, a pop-up show for 2 days. And then we exhibited it in Kiev, next edition. Then Venice again, 2 years ago, and then here we are in Dubai. And I think it's important because of accessibility. The country is relatively isolated. There are not so many international art professionals traveling there. A few curators even aware of the cultural context. So those kind of pop-up interventions here and there in the cultural cities of the world is significant. And what's important is that we're not presenting it on the behalf of the country, right? We are more oriented towards community and artists, and it's a very informal style. It's a informal storytelling. Let's say we don't really make most of the decisions in advance. It's rather spontaneous. And why am I even talking about it?
Yeah. You're doing beautifully, Vlad.
But before we continue, thank you, Vladek, for anticipating my next question. But you have just seen how artist stories are being told by those who are not artists, as you introduced yourself. So I would like to go back to pause and the original question, and still give an opportunity to the artists to perhaps object to a presentation, but they got not necessarily here, but in any other situation when your story was translated differently. I'm not saying mistranslated, but presented differently from the way you intended. Would anyone like to comment on that?
But I have commented the previous your question about how was the change of the idea in this context, in this venue. First of all, I want to thank you, Leeza, to invite us and give 5 stars for organizations for Alserkal Avenue. It's perfect. Thank you. And of course, the food is perfect.
Yes.
It's great. As an organizer, I know how it's difficult to do this job. Talking about changing in our story. While we're preparing here, we pretend to be a serious curators and so on, and think about the big institutions, how we present in the world, going on context and so on. But here, while we make a tours for you, it's became more a sensitive story about how Kazakh artist community is like a family, And while we're talking about these links, who are friend with whom, who are dating with whom, and so on, it became like a Brazilian movie, and this is great. I think this is life, and this is how the showing to the audience and reacting of the audience was change idea of the exhibition and story of the exhibition. And I want to also add, it's not the answer of your second question, but important story for me. Kazakhstan is very new country, and we are still working on our identity, who we are. Are we Kazakhs? Are we nomads? Or we are post-Soviet country? Or we were colonized by Russians? Or we we're trying to be a rich country, Muslim rich country, and so on. And in this field, I see the difference, a lot of difference with Asian art, but also a lot of comments. And this is great, and thank you all to be the part of me of this my experience here.
Yeah, merci.
Ola, Vlad, and Enrico next to are very close to the artists, and that's why I think they are the first agents in communication of artist stories, and they have an opportunity to also tell a collective story. So both Vlad and Ola as a duo and Enrico as a gallery present a collective, a small collective of artists. Enrico, would you introduce your collective story?
Yeah. So my name is Enrico. I'm Italian. I have a gallery in Shanghai that I opened 2 years ago. It's called Capsule. I opened Capsule with an ambition in mind and also a mission to introduce a new group of emerging artists in the Chinese context. So for this edition of the film meeting, I brought actually 2 artists. Gao Yuan is an artist that I've been working since my very beginning, so when I started opening the gallery. And Wang Haiyang is a new collaboration that just started in November. When Leeza told me about the topic of the film meeting, then I thought that these 2 artists could really fit into the context. When I visited, for example, Gao Yuan the first time, she had this huge amount of artworks comprised of over 40 paintings and 400 paperworks that she hadn't been either selling or showing before, because she was planning to combine them into an animation that you will see then in the Warehouse 47. And for me, it was also a fact of seeing an artist as a collector of his own proper work, keeping this huge amount of work for such a long time before finding the right opportunity to display. And on the same way, the work of Wang Haiyang that you will see as well later is made out of a group that unfortunately we couldn't bring totally here of 10 paperworks, but the whole group is actually 50 paperworks. And the conception of the work started in 2014, and then only 2018 it came up with the animation. So I thought that our team, our project was really fitting the theme of the film meeting this year. On the other hand, talking about my own experience as a gallerist and all the struggle as well, I was sympathizing with Leeza before when she was talking about funding, and because everybody has a misconception probably sometimes that commercial gallery is actually a machine that makes money. But I'm a young gallery. I started 2 years ago in a very casual way, meaning that it's like self-funded. And over the past 2 years, I've been running like 15 exhibitions. And I want probably to focus on one specific show that I had, because I think it's quite fitting as well the context of this talk right now. I had a show last year in November with an artist-run space, which is called Practice. I don't know if any of you is familiar with this artist-run space in New York. And it was originally run by 3 artists, now they just became 2. And they have this space in Chinatown that is promoting, in a very casual way, exhibition of artists that are primarily Asian, but they have these kind of migratory transitions between different countries. Probably they're Asian or Chinese, local Chinese, and they studied abroad. So I think one of my missions in this context, in this gallery, is actually to create a context where people can really connect to each other And I'm very happy that I had a chance actually to be here today in a place which is totally new for me and presented two Chinese artists.
I would like to also have introduce Mariam and have her say a few things because she's joined ACAW as a curatorial fellow. She's doing her master's at NYU right now, and without her, we would not be having a field meeting. So she's been literally slaving away for the last 6 months on this project. But she, in her own right, has been in the system for a long while in Iran, and in her own right, an institution. So I'd like to have her say something because the 3 artists from Iran is a contribution to field meeting from her work.
Thank you. So the first thing when we talked with Leeza about having some Iranian artists, because so I've been in Iran for more like 30 years or so, so I knew like a lot about contemporary art in Iran. And then when I moved to US, I saw like how Iranian artists are being represented in like Western context. So when I was thinking about bringing some artists, I was thinking about something not related to the stereotypes that we already have in different contexts. And that's why I thought about like Bahman, Rana, and Ali, that I've known them about Bahman and Ali. I'm following their works for more than, I think, 6-7 years. So I was very familiar with their works. And then, yeah, I thought that's a great opportunity to have and see different concepts of Iran contemporary art in this region. So, yeah, that was the story. And thank you, Leeza, for giving me this opportunity.
The first person you should thank is yourself.
How much time do we have?
5 minutes?
5 minutes. So I suppose that if any of the people on the panel would like to add something on representation, on change of the work in presentation, that would be an opportunity to do so. And then we look forward to questions from everyone as well as comments.
I just want, does this work? Yes. I just wanted to add a little snippet as well that has changed in my work. And that's in the way that I'm addressing the visually impaired. I have within this pop-up show a collection of books that I made that allows the audience to touch the works. And it was important actually for me to do this because I began questioning how exclusive the visual arts actually are. And the idea of accessibility has become an important part of my thinking right now. And so as a collective of artists here, it's wonderful to have the conversation with everyone about it and to see how we're going to address these different types of disabilities and make our work more accessible.
I would like to maybe try to answer your question about how sometimes the artwork can be changed or transformed in the frame of exhibitions. I noticed something that happened to me in the last year and a half, that maybe institutions or curators, they tend to identify your work in certain categories, and sometimes it could create a certain limitation, or probably, if I would be very negative, an instrumentalization. So I noticed that this year I'm mainly invited to feminist exhibition, which I'm very happy about. And also I can also observe for artists, friends, that we got invited for what we kind of represent, and it also sometimes can, exoticized or limited, like like the spectrum of what we are, like of what, for example, I'm thinking or working in my studio. And it's create a very ambiguous situation, because of course the certain context, let's say if I speak about like feminist environment, I'm totally happy and want to take part to it. But on another hand, it also creates the representation maybe of women in certain exhibition context as still it says a minority. So this is also something that can also happen. I mean, I don't know if I was very clear, but.
I just wanted to make a comment about just why this group of people and why today, because, I mean, sitting together, because trust me, it's like really quite vulnerable and terrifying to do exactly what you're saying, right? Because if you are not constantly questioning yourself, what your choices are, part of the questioning for the whole field meeting is, as curators, as artists, as institutions, because our job does entail selecting, that actually means discrimination. And I'm not talking about discrimination in the sense of like saying, Xing out things, but the fact is that we have to discriminate and choose particular things because there's always a limitation. It can't go on forever abundant and you can't include everyone. That is, curatorial work is discriminatory work. And yet, how do you do it compassionately? How do you do it thoughtfully with full consciousness? And it's like I've had to both use my mind and my heart, and then even my uterus, which is super connected to the feminist part that we don't even have connection to. We don't even know how to work from that organ. But at some point when I let go and just let it come to me, after like 20 revisions, that's why the schedule doesn't get sent to you until like 2 weeks before, something magical happens where like you asked, what is the surprising thing that happens? Like, I can't believe how many people talked about writing in this panel. Did I know that you were writing? No, I had no clue. Did I know that he was, yes and no. Like there's this other underlying magic that happens at the end of the day with the intention of making things come together, having that generosity and feeling and questioning and being scared does give that protection. It's when you are like very sure exactly what to do and you're totally convinced, that's when it becomes problematic. And so even like in this moment, I'm like, does this make sense? Is it, but it in a way when I see, for me it does. And what I was trying to do here today was not to put, M+ with, the mother institution, the one that we all look out for, the knight in armor, shining armor that comes and saves you and has all kinds of, possibilities, and and then to separate that from the Eurasian Cultural Alliance, or to separate that from Amina, or to separate that from Francesca, or any of these, and to say, actually, there is a purpose. Each one of them have a role, and we're all making accessibility. And what just Amina said about having her artworks being able to touch something, and for Lara for, I mean, the incredible thoughtfulness of what, you know, what I was so struck by was how aware of what it takes to be also understand the collective, the population of Asia, and consider all parts of it in this process of like creating a digital interface. And these are all very, very brave things to do, and it doesn't matter if it's like a giant institution or a small person, the power is always the same, because the power is only inside each individual. And if Lara was not at M+, we probably wouldn't really have all the stuff that's taking place in there. And that's what was for me more of the telling of that story, and sort of leveling everything and saying, let's just stop being afraid or complaining about our status or position and the fact that we barely make any money and all that stuff, and really let ourselves, because it's our choice, feed ourselves from the work that we've been able to do, and to acknowledge what an amazing thing it is to do. And just to have Francesca a little bit more contextualize, like the original idea for her was to share more about the experience of being a foreigner working in Afghanistan and someone who has to read and understand and then interpret Afghan art for the artists and the navigations of that vulnerable situation and the projections of everybody's attitudes or feeling that she may do something harmful, which could be possible, but we can't let that stop us. So I did kind of want to bring that part in. It was important. And then we do have time, we have to go to lunch, but if anyone has a really like important thing they want to ask, a question from the audience, please feel free to do it. And if anyone really needs to leave the room, they can. And also, if any of you here would like to say anything else, it's important for you to have that time. If you need to, we can stay a little bit longer. I can, at least.
Hi, is this working? So since yesterday, I think there's a lot of trajectories that we've touched upon, and it's taken a lot of interesting directions. But this particular session resonated a lot with me, and it addressed a lot of issues that I'm interested in. And so I just quickly wanted to make 2-3 small points before I address the questions. I think what was really interesting was, Francesca, your paper. I know I talked to you outside as well. It was incredibly moving for many, many reasons. I come from Pakistan. We see this all around us. But also in this context, when you presented it, it was very, very haunting and kind of, I think, summarizes why we are here and how we are talking beyond the boundaries of how we talk about art. So taking that, and then something in your bio which talked about de-exoticizing the Afghan art. And after that, Lara spoke about the work that you're doing at M+. But it was really interesting how you started. It said when you grew up in Hong Kong, you'd always thought about culture being outside. This is how we approached art theory in Pakistan as well. We go to a British art school. It was set up by the British colonizers. It's like 170 plus years. We end up only reading Western theory. And so the idea that culture is outside, you need to know that before you can address yourself and the canons that you're speaking about. And then when we moved into the pop-ups, the 2 works that really stood out, one was Amina's work. You talk about accessibility, but what really intrigued me was when we were touching the works, it was, you don't touch work, but that's changing in many, kind of different settings. But it was leaving our finger grease, and it was kind of reshaping the works, and you had these works on carbon also, which, I worked closely with Lala Rukh, and a lot of museums, kind of complained about, or not complain, but talk about these works not having archival quality, which a lot of South Asian artists have not been dealing with. And then finally with Vlad and Olga, putting together works which are collective ownership and archiving of the self. So all of this comes together in a very kind of interesting framework of institutional critique or issues of institutional critique that are on the global south. But what's problematic is curators are beginning from outside to parachute in, and they're interested in this exoticization of what they see, and as Leeza said, the selection of works. But how it's manifesting in a really strange way that artists are beginning to self-fetishize. And so my question was towards two people specifically because of all of this context. Francesca in the role of a director of an arts institute, and Lara when storytelling with a collecting museum. How do you deal with these frameworks not coming in of this self-fetishization and this Orientalist view towards this region? Sorry, this was really long, but...
Can you actually introduce yourself? Because you are part of the respondents group. So what you're doing is, you shouldn't be apologizing for it. You were given that role.
So my name is Saira Ansari. I'm an independent researcher and writer, but I also work with the Sharjah Art Foundation, where I work with research and publications.
So how do I begin? I guess coming here and speaking on behalf of an institution was, in some ways, as Leeza suggested, an active kind of integration and almost reconciliation of, the containers of, myself, my own experience, and the institution I belong to, and how my practice and intentions kind of manifest in an institutional context. I mentioned that I used to be, I am a writer, but I used to be a journalist, and it's so important to me to think about what I do and the purpose of what I do from the perspective here, because you're right, there's a lot of kind of parachuting in, a lot of judgment, fetishization, and sort of glory that comes with being the outsider who knows, expat. I'm not an expat, although I kind of present as one to many. I'm a Hong Kong local. When I was with the Wall Street Journal, I would often get called up, or I'd go to New York and I'd meet editors, and they would always, you want to know what's going on in Asia, and they would use this New York perspective and ask, so Lara, what's the conversation in Asia? As if there was one conversation, as if there were one Asia. And it was this kind of educational process where I'd have to, and even in terms of tone of voice and storytelling and thinking about your audiences, even that reconciliation between, who you're speaking to, how much do you have to explain, how much do you have to translate? Translation is something that's also really interesting to me. And, when you're speaking to someone who kind of understands that fundamental, there are many Asias and there are many conversations, and this is what, the diversity of what we're trying to represent. And of course, we can't be comprehensive, as open-ended as we want to be, and as generous as we want to be in terms of inviting in new narratives. There's a kind of, we're starting from a certain place. And so, yeah, thank you for asking that question. Thank you, Leeza, for bringing me here to sort of create that, it's kind of a reconciliation for me and an integration for me of these sort of two paths and seeing them as one whole, because, that's how I reconcile those two things. And, Asian narratives, even as a writer, I used to be, I started an MFA, actually, in creative writing, and it was from an Asian perspective. So again, this is kind of coming out again and again, and it's interesting. I did not expect to be talking about this at this, in this forum, but I wasn't able to complete the MFA because I had a child, and then I also had an institution, and we're actually giving birth to this institution, and this is where my energies are, and this is where my focus is. But it's fundamental to my intention, and I think our intention as a transnational museum. We're a global museum. We're not a Hong Kong museum, although our perspective is from Hong Kong, and our perspective comes from our Hong Kong context. But I think it's so beautifully united with what our purpose here is of being here together today, thinking about the many Asias, thinking about all the conversations that are coming from so many different places, but they're so connected. So, yeah.
I think for me, there are two answers. One is the profoundly damaging effect that tokenism has on Afghan artists. I remember talking to a young artist who was included in Documenta 13, and to this day, he believes that he was included to the show because of his passport. So I wasn't ready. I wasn't meant to be there. And people questioned whether it was okay for me to be there. And I still feel that sort of complex of being there, not because of the quality of my work, but because of who I'm there to represent. And I think there is an underestimation of how profound the damage can be. And that is one part of the answer. The second part is that the only thing that I can do is to give my time. And the self-exotization can be questioned only through time and through the trust that is built over time. Because those who parachute in and out have only positive comments. There's never a critique. And so if you are the one who's there and tries to build a more critical approach to the work, then you're always a bit the party pooper, because, you know, how is it possible that everyone says that I'm good, and you come here and you say, well, no, actually, there's more work to do. And that only comes with time, and that is accepted only if people understand that you're not doing it because you're a party pooper, but you're doing it because you have their own interest in mind.
Thank you so much.